Well, James, how are you doing today?
I'm good, Will. Thank you so much for having me. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on. I really appreciate it. Do you mind giving us a brief bio and some of the big ideas you're interested in?
Sure, sure. Let's see. So, by training, I'm a chemist and materials engineer. I've been into startups since I actually spun out my undergraduate research thesis at 21 and in my first startup.
Nice.
Um, yeah. Well, at the time, I didn't realize what the undertaking would be. So ignorance happened to play well in my favor. We were printing solar panels.
Oh, cool.
And yeah, that sounds really sexy. It sounds way sexier than it actually is. But I was working on a project in my undergrad where the research advisor I was working under had developed a new set of dyes. It's similar to the dyes you put into clothes, where they absorb certain kinds of light, so blue, green, yellow, red, etc. But they tune these dyes in a way to make them semiconducting. And
Cool.
the vision was that these dyes, because they were carbon based, could be in the same way that a printer prints dyes for a page of paper. You could put these dyes into a printer as well and print those panels.
Oh, cool.
It turns out that me and the research professor had two different visions on how the research should go. He was very much interested in expanding the academic school of thought, whereas I couldn't let go of the potential future vision of seeing the world printed in solar panels. So like
Yeah.
just coded the entire, I believe at the time, this is in 2016 or 2015. If you could cover the state of Rhode Island in solar panels, you would be able to provide enough energy for everyone in the United States and some.
Oh, nice.
So it doesn't take a lot of square area, right? And so,
Yeah.
so once I saw that, I couldn't let go of the idea. We ended up working with a set of materials called perovskites. I went to school at RIT. It turns out there was a bunch of Kodak professors there, so they helped us work through getting into contact with Kodak, figuring out how
Oh,
we could
cool.
develop all this. And then, as all great technologies come to bear, you had to figure out what the economic forces look like.
Right.
So I had a big awakening about what business even means and why it's important. I understood your costs have to be less than what you make.
Yeah.
Grab economic things, whatnot. But it turns out that if you look at the economics of the solar industry, the panel, the thing that absorbs the light,
Yeah.
makes up about 5% of the cost of installing a solar panel on a roof, on a farm, anywhere.
Really?
60% of the cost comes from the labor of installation and the certification of the install.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
So it's like
So what
permitting and
that
things like that?
exactly. So the
Oh,
land
wow.
that you're going to build on. So one thing a lot of people don't consider is the fact that you're working with high voltage materials, and so you
Uh,
need those things to be installed at a very tight spec. Like you can imagine, if a solar cell's installed on even your house aren't properly insulated from the rain, like you could burn down that house. You know,
oh, God.
you don't want these things casually installed. You need to make sure that they're done to a certain grade with a certain level of specialization. People go to school, like specialized training for these kinds of things. And so
Gotcha.
obviously the specialization there, the permitting, so on and so forth, makes it such that it's actually a fairly large limiting factor in solar. And so the vision that we had of coding the world in solar panels is like, okay, great, we can do that. But it turns out that what's holding the world back is not the ability to produce panels, but the cost of installing them.
Oh,
And
wow.
so once I realized that fact and understood that, as incredible of an innovation as we had been commercializing, even if it was to get to the absolute zenith of its capacity, where we could produce solar panels that, pennies on the dollar of what silicon could. So
Yeah.
let's just say we brought that 5% down to zero, it still wouldn't move the needle on fixing climate change. And
Gotcha.
that's when I was like, well, good first shot on goal. All right, like on to the next one.
Right.
Um, yeah. So I like thinking a lot about energy generation, about power, about distribution there. I really like all the cutting edge research you're seeing on fusion, like Commonwealth, general fusion, so on and so forth. And then in my second startup, we were doing bioextractions, and we did a lot of iteration. We went through Y Combinator for this one. We started
Nice.
off in the coffee space, transitioned from coffee to cannabis extraction because cannabis is way more profitable, right? So high profitability, whereas solar panels very low profitability. Kind
Right.
of learned my lesson. And then what I quickly learned was that there was a call to do better things, to take my talents and put them to better use than to extracting cannabis.
Yeah.
I felt like I had a higher calling in life than being
Right.
a drug dealer.
Fair enough.
So yeah, we kind of iterated our way through that. We realized people were using cannabis to put themselves to sleep. Did a sleep coaching business for about a year, and ultimately I fell out of love with that, and realized that I was in the services business, I was in the software business, but really my background is in chemistry, it's in
Yeah.
materials. I love the physical world of atoms, and that's what I wanted to help bring to life. So I co-founded the Deep Tech Fellowship at On Deck with my partner Abhijit to help other people find their groove, their niche of bringing their atomic innovations to the real world. So that was my arc. And now the thing that I'm thinking about is how can we unlock more laboratory innovation to actually be commercial, real world products that help people and businesses on an everyday.
I really love that. And it seems like, deep tech and building things in the real world is especially challenging versus,
Mm.
software. You can build a software business for like 100K, get it off
Yeah.
the ground. But man, like the
Yep.
real world, there's all like, it's like you're increasing the number of factors you have to worry about so much, like regulatory challenges, like you described with,
Massive.
solar panels.
Massive.
You know,
Yep.
it almost seems like you want to dissuade people from trying to go after this. Like it's very difficult. How do you keep the faith and like, because it's obviously it's very, very important. Probably that's the answer, right? It's super important that we actually have
Mm.
physical innovation. But yeah, how do you coach founders through that? And maybe that's too general a question, but I'm curious how you think about that.
I think faith is actually an interesting question of like, because to me that applies that concept. How do you know to keep building anything? It's sort of,
Right.
in my opinion, a little bit more general. It doesn't just apply to deep tech. And I think what you're scratching at is true in that the cost of working in deep tech is higher, or and so in an effect, your conviction for what you're working on needs to be that much higher. So you even see this. I think it's starting to change now, but over definitely the past decade, if not two, you can see that even venture capitalists also dissuaded folks from working on things that are hardware oriented, that are
Yeah.
deep tech oriented. I think part of why Kickstarter came about and became such a commercial success is because investors were afraid to touch things in the hardware
Wouldn't touch
space.
hardware.
Absolutely.
Fitbit doesn't, Pebble doesn't work. There's all these like stories like that.
Yeah, exactly. Even though I think Pebble was what the most funded
Yeah.
Kickstarter up until that time, right? Crazy. Um, so yeah, how do you keep the faith? I think part of that is by removing the how would I put this? Founders are the kinds of people who have like a vision for what the world could be.
Yeah.
And it's their job to crawl through the mud, to crawl through whatever barriers are going in their way to manifest that future.
Yeah.
And I think what I find is most important is to just remind people who are building the future to not listen to the people telling them that they're wrong. It's
Nice.
so easy to criticize and to come up with reasons why something shouldn't work.
Right.
And I think that kind of a check is useful when done in a way to say, okay, but have you thought about this other way? Like, I
Gotcha.
think the direction you're going down may not be useful, or you might run into some technical issues, but there might be this other route. Whereas, like traditionally, especially if you see it on social media, a lot of people are like, oh, this is a stupid idea. Like, why would you do this? The world's bad enough as it is. Like, we
Right.
don't need to extend life, right? As an
Exactly.
example. And so it becomes like just tell the folks that are building the future to ignore the naysayers, and remind them as well that when they make silly mistakes, when they make first time founder mistakes,
Yeah.
that those are the kinds of things that everyone in their first shot does because they're fresh.
Right.
So don't beat yourself up, and then don't listen to the naysayers is the TLDR.
Gotcha. And how do you determine who can give you good feedback and who is just gonna
Huh.
like, what I mean? Because it seems like it's a real difficult challenge, and you want to try and think through these things as best as you can, and you want to like get good feedback from people, but at the same time, you
Totally.
do need to like be singularly focused on it.
Yeah. Oh, you touch on a few things there, right? And at the last point, I think focus is actually the most potent wedge that founders have to displace the present from the future that they're trying to manifest. So If you think about it, like the tip of a missile as an example, it's what's breaking, or a rocket, what have you. It's breaking through the resistance of the air and whatnot, and literally pressing it aside for you to penetrate through and work through. And so that tip, that edge is where focus is most important. Because if not, then you have sort of like a dull tip and you're not
Right.
really making any headway on one specific direction. But in terms of where to get feedback, I think that's actually a harder question to answer than it might sound, because like you could list a bunch of characteristics and say like, oh, look for this, don't look for that, or these are the good things, these are the bad things.
Yeah.
But in a day like, or modern day like 2021, where information is so abundant, right? YouTube is incredible, Google's amazing, Wikipedia has more stuff than you can read in a lifetime. I wonder what the stat is. How many lifetimes would it take to read all of Wikipedia?
It's a great question.
It's got to be a lot, right? Anyways, the specific knowledge that comes through experience are the kinds of things that are differentiated from what you could read in a textbook, what you can get in a classroom, what you can get on YouTube. And so to that avail, Naval actually has a really great nugget on this, where it's like unique knowledge is what's valuable in the modern day. And that's what people get paid to like transfer over to you. So I would say people who have done it before, either things that are in a similar industry as you at a cutting edge, or who have gone through the process of going from 0 to 1, who have gone from literally bootstrapping or creating from scratch anything. Ideally, it would be a business if you're interested in business, and even more ideally, it'd be in the same industry that you're in. But oftentimes, you can talk to someone who made, a small startup in software, and they can give you advice, better advice, I would say, than some critic on Twitter about what you should be doing, what you shouldn't be doing, common mistakes like raising too much money, hiring people too quickly, not being focused is another common mistake, and that's across any space, any industry.
Yeah, I really like that. I really like that. And I'm curious, what do you look for? You guys just launched ODX, which is super cool. Kind of a big fund to invest in a lot of people within the fellowship, and I want to talk about the fellowship too here in a little bit.
Sure, let's do it.
How do you think about selecting founders? What do you look for? Do you look for technical aptitude? Do you look for idea fit? I'm assuming it's just some mishmash of all that, and it's probably unique each time, right? It's not like one thing.
Yeah. Well, the value prop of ODX was to fund founders or people that have the potential to be founders earlier than anyone else.
Nice.
We want to take bets on folks before other people have the conviction that this is someone who is talented, who can execute, who has what it takes. And the best way to do that is to recognize or to pattern match in what your experiences have been as a founder. So, right, like I'm lucky or experienced in that I've done 2 startups. Abhijit has been involved in a number of startups. Ashwin, another program partner at On Deck, Deep Tech. Also, the ODX team has a lot of folks that have built startups and also invested in startups. So we use heuristics like the velocity of execution. I think that's a really, really great example. So it's like, how many things have you been able to accomplish towards your focused point since you first had the idea? I think another important factor is why someone wants to do this. Now more than ever, right? And you see this a lot in Web3 and crypto. There's the opportunity to speculate on NFTs, on new coins, projects, so on and so forth. And so if your desire is to become wealthy, I actually think that startups aren't the most efficient way to do that. And there's nothing wrong necessarily in wanting to be wealthy, but if that's your primary goal, if that's what wakes you up in the morning, I think a startup is actually an inefficient way to acquire that vision, or that dream.
Right.
So why people are doing it matters a lot as well. And teasing that out is actually harder than it might seem, because sometimes people don't even recognize their own motivations. And so through a conversation, through the experiences they've had, the choices they've made, you can start to tease those things out. So yeah, it's complicated, but at the end of the day, you're betting on a person.
Right.
At the early stages, right?
Yeah.
So if you look at funding at the Series A level, Series B level, so on and so forth, you look at the execution of the team, the company, their metrics, their MRR, their ARR. For those that don't know, that's monthly recurring revenue and annually recurring revenue. Whereas in the beginning, right, at the pre-seed stage, you don't have those data points. Oftentimes, especially in the deep tech space, you don't have any revenue. There's none of
Right.
that to judge. So you have to be a good judge of character. You have to be a good judge of the person. And like anything else in this space, it's very risky. So oftentimes we're wrong, but we are here to be in the business of supporting people who otherwise never would have been able to get into business, because they were slept on. They didn't go to the right university. They didn't have the right credentials. And that makes me really, really happy as someone who, also didn't go to MIT or Harvard or Stanford to
Yeah.
be in business, to have gotten into a Y Combinator, to be building a community like this. To me, it's really important to be able to reach out and give that opportunity to folks who otherwise didn't have that privilege and didn't get the chance to go to those universities, because those folks are often just as hardworking, just as intelligent, just as resourceful as anyone else at an Ivy League school.
When you're looking at people and, you're trying to evaluate founders, how do you think about finding that $20 bill on the sidewalk? Is it valuing like substance over status? Like, this person's actually done a lot. They may not have, gone to MIT, but they've got like, they've actually done a lot of these things. Like how do you, and is it just unique every time for each person?
So I think you're scratching at something that's definitely echoing its way through the societal fabric, which is how important is the status symbols that you carry? Like how valuable is that multi-$100,000 piece of paper and the education that it symbolically represents versus a list of your accomplishments? And I think that there's a diverse set of camps here. Some people that are extreme one way, extreme another way, in between, and then the full spectrum across. My take is it's now more important than ever to show that you can do the thing that you are passionate about. It's more important to show that you're the kind of person that can persevere through adversity and that can break down walls, because the future is unfortunately mostly uncertain. There's an interesting quote that I like that talks about how entrepreneurs have a certain vision of a certain part of the future that they feel like is certain, and it's their job to manifest that, to will that future into reality.
Yeah.
And so they have, a specific imagination about what the future can look like, what it should look like, and they're working to build that into reality. But across the whole, we don't know how tomorrow, next year, the next decade, the next century will look. And so the ability to problem solve abstract problems, to create resources when you didn't have any, to turn nothing into something, that is generally a good sign of someone who knows how to get things done, even when they don't have everything that they might necessarily need. And that is a phenomenal precursor or identifying factor for someone that would make a good entrepreneur, a good founder. And you can't necessarily accredit that thing. There's no place you can go to get a stamp of approval that says that. It's shown through the efforts that you've put in and the consequences of those efforts. And so I like to think that, especially if you're, as an example, a software person, your portfolio goes way farther than your degree. So if you have a PhD from Stanford, that's good, but show me your Git repo where you have thousands of stars and millions of views or uses. That shows way more that you actually know how to implement the knowledge that you supposedly would have gained in a university setting. So I'm absolutely with the camp that what you've done, the proof of your work, matters way more than the status of the thing that you come from. But I think you still have to acknowledge that in this day and age, a lot of people are lazily just looking for ways to just say, oh, this seems like a good pick. Cool. I'm not going to think about it. Moving on to the next one. Yeah. And that's where these status style emblems come into play and where you find them to be useful. But for the folks that are working at the very, very cutting edge, they value more your grit and your tenacity and your ability to get things done. So if you are in the process of trying to change the world, in a way, it's easier for you to not go to school and to instead prove that you can execute. I think I'm struggling to remember who said this, but the smartest decision you could have made last year would, at the beginning of COVID, would be to get into Stanford, start on the first day, and then drop out before tuition was supposed to be collected. Right. And so that way you have the Stanford dropout, but you save all the time to execute you would have anyways. So you have both the credential and the time to execute and to get stuff done and kind of live the best of both worlds.
I love that. I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little hack.
That would be a great hack. And I recommend that to anybody who gets in Stanford, give it a try. Um, that's listening. James, you mentioned something earlier. It was velocity of execution.
Yeah,
I want you to talk about that a little bit more, and I want to harp on this a little bit because I think it's something people can control. So I think that's really
sure,
good. You can't. There's things you
absolutely.
can't control, but you can control velocity of execution. And something I've noticed. I've recorded about 80 episodes so far, and the correlation between how successful someone has been and how fast they get back to me. And you did a great job with this. You got back really fast. It's a really weird thing I've noticed. So Balaji, the founder of Visa, got back to me within like 10 minutes. Answered
No
their own
way.
email. Yes, it's very very
That's
weird.
incredible.
You got back to me really fast. There's a lot of and so I think like that is a metric of perhaps judging people is an interesting one. And of course, things happen. You can't always get back to people fast, but
Of course.
it's just something I've noticed. So velocity of execution. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. I find it really interesting that I remember actually Patrick Collison, I want to say. No, it was Paul Graham commenting on Patrick Collison's speed of reply echoes your sentiment here as well. I think that's really interesting. As a devil's advocate case, maybe someone is on vacation or doing a
Oh
dope
yeah,
thing fast, and
yeah.
so
You
they
might
don't
have
have
other
access
things
to their
going on.
electronics.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
exactly.
Yeah,
So I say that just so the listeners like, because I know if I got that advice at 16, I'd be like, all right, I'm always staring at my email, like
exactly.
waiting for the next
Doing
opportunity to come
nothing
in.
else. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Just like looking and being like, cool, I got it back in 15 microseconds. Like, I'm
Exactly.
good. They're going to think I'm amazing. So yeah, don't take that too literally.
Yeah.
um, and actually to that point, I remember Naval has a point where he makes it a case to not do coffee because he's too busy, thinking or
Yeah.
kind of working through other processes. So, teach their own. Anyways, velocity of execution. That was the question. I think that I want to default to something that Elon Musk really inspired in me or the first time I heard it was from Elon, which was if you have a better than average, so greater than 50% rate of being correct on the experiments or the executions that you make, then you should make as many of them as possible because you multiply or the aggregate the results of being more often than not correct. Right. So if you do like a quick math here, right, if you're correct 60% of the time and you do things 10 times, then in theory, I guess what would that be? It would be half plus one. Okay, actually, a different mental model to use, because this reminds me as well of a James Clear point where there's a graph that shows basically if you get 1% better every day versus 1% worse every day, after a year, 0.99 brought to 365 goes basically near to 1, and then 1.01 brought to the 365th power goes to something in the hundreds. So it goes to show basically how the effect of compounding over time has really, really strong benefit. And Sam Altman also talks about the fact that humans, I should say, in general, have a hard time understanding the strength and the value of exponential compounding curves. So execution velocity leverages the same mathematical principles, which is every time you execute, in theory, you should learn something. And again, if you're making better than average decisions, then you are learning, because you're learning something from your executions. Then every time you execute, presumably you're going to get further and further and further toward, I should say, whatever your goal is. And so the difference between you working 40 hours a week and you working 100 hours a week is you will get done in 1 year working 100 hours a week what it takes someone else 2.5 years to get done. Now, I will say on the flip side of that, it is, I don't want to say impossible, but extraordinarily difficult to maintain that clip of execution at 100 hours a week for an entire year, and for that matter, for decades. So, keep in mind that you have to factor in the human accountability aspect there, right? The fact that we are not machines. However, the more experimentation you can do, the more you get to uncover about what your unknowns are. And the sooner you get to figure out, okay, is this thing that I believed right or wrong? And then what can I do as a consequence of being right or wrong? It kind of allows you to explore the decision tree matrix with increased velocity. And because we know, right, that the future is still uncertain, you can't know until you go and you try that experiment. If everything was completely known, then there'd be no reason to. You could just kind of like magically preordain exactly what would be, and you just need to do exactly the right one thing in order to have that future manifest.
Right.
But because it's unknown, because we cannot tell exactly what will happen tomorrow, next year, next decade, you have to iterate your way and experiment your way through it. And that's why, to come back to an original point, having someone who's done that, who's had to go through decision matrix decisions before, helps you figure out, what am I doing right? What am I doing wrong? What should I get better at? What am I doing that I shouldn't? So that specific, unique knowledge helps in that like future forecasting, but no amount of expertise can outweigh the importance of executing. And so that's why it's the velocity of execution, not the velocity of thinking, as an example.
Got it. And, when you're first getting started, or you're thinking about getting started and actually launching something, is there a checklist you go through, or you would recommend people to go through, or like, is it just like you should spend a lot of time thinking about it, evaluating it? I don't know.
Oh God. So this is kind of an interesting one. I would say I feel like I'm saying it depends so often. So I want to say something different.
It very well may depend. So,
different strokes for different folks. Maybe that's the better use case here. If you look at someone like Elon Musk, it doesn't take him very long to decide he's going to do something. He just decides one day, I'm going to dig tunnels underneath LA, and starts the Boring Company.
It's time.
Or I'm going to merge computers/AI with humans and start Neuralink.
Yeah.
That's it. There are other folks who it takes them decades of inner work and working through whatever it is that's holding them back. In some cases, it's adversity from a happenstance perspective. You weren't born in the right country or to the right family, so on and so forth. In other cases, it's that you didn't find the need or the drive to stoke that flame until later in life, that conviction, let's say. So for other people, it takes them decades to kind of have that level of conviction to say like, okay, I'm going to go all in on a project and see if I can build something, if I can manifest something worth doing. But for my personal self, I think it's important to figure out why I'm doing what I'm doing, because at the end of the day, time is our most valuable and limited asset, right? You can always make more money. You can always try something else, but you can't get back the time that you've invested. And so being completely honest with myself about my intention here is really, really important. And that can be, again, harder than it sounds, because we can easily deceive ourselves. Right. Where what starts off as shiny object syndrome gets rationalized to be like, oh, I just want to see if there's a cool opportunity here, which turns out to be like, I've already invested too much time into this that I feel like I have to keep going. It's this gambler's fallacy of, well, eventually it'll turn out red, even if it's just continue to be black. And it turns out that doesn't necessarily mean anything. It doesn't have to. Statistics can mess with you mercilessly. So I would always urge people to figure out, what is your intention first and foremost. And if you are coming from it from a pure perspective of intention, of like a curiosity of growth, like I want to see, hey, is this a challenge I can overcome? I'm like, okay, that's a great reason. Is it an intellectual curiosity? But if it's like, oh, I want to put this on my resume, or I want to impress this person, or I feel like it's, the cool thing to do, then you're better off, finding something else that's going to be less painful, because starting a company and actually going in takes a lot out of you. And it's like running a series of sprints for years, and most companies fail. So if you're not comfortable with the prize being self-exploration and learning, recognizing that there might not be a financial payout, then I would say don't even start the thing. So when it comes to a checklist, though, I think there are some basic things that people should keep in mind if they do want to start a company. Particularly in the hardware space, if you're technical, make sure that it's feasible for this thing to be built, right?
Sounds
like
important.
If you have an idea, right? No, but seriously, if you want to create like a wormhole generator to teleport things around, it's like,
Maybe
figure
not.
out at least theoretically how it could be done. Right.
Right.
Like, how about that for step one,
Yeah.
instead of going around and being like, telling venture capitalists why they're stupid for not investing.
Right. Exactly.
you
Richard
know,
Hamming says you have to have an attack. You have to have an attack on the
yes,
problem. If you don't have an
absolutely.
attack, you
Absolutely.
shouldn't do it.
For sure. No doubt. I completely agree with that. And I think this is especially true for technical people. And if you're not technical, get technical enough that you can talk to someone who could help you identify that attack. So as an example, if I wanted to do a piece of software, which is not, my zone of genius, then I would, if I was really passionate about this idea, watch enough YouTube videos that I could use some kind of crappy Python or no code tool to put this thing together in such a way that I could get at least something out there that I could show someone else or describe to someone who might be able to interpret what I'm trying to do.
Gotcha.
Right. And so with code, it's really easy for you to cobble together these Frankenstein styles experiments,
Yeah.
because the cost of experimentation is so low. It's literally just a computer and an internet connection. And in some cases, you don't even need an internet connection. Whereas in the hardware space, I think because the cost of experimenting is so much more prohibitive for iteration. So let's take a random example. If you wanted to make a new water purifier, let's say, that's going to cost you more than an internet connection and a computer. Yeah. It might cost you like a few grand in parts, materials, actually going and having a space where you could do the mechanical, the chemical, electrical engineering to do the water filtration. I would consider first, maybe if there's a need for this thing before you go out and you build it. There are some cases, right? There's always exceptions to the rules. So a friend of mine named, I don't know if he'd want me telling this story. So a friend of mine, yes, was working on a protein detection device where basically you could detect the presence of a certain biological material in a sample. And it turns out that midway through them going through building this, COVID came and hit. And they thought, well, we can sense biological material. Let's build a COVID test to sense and help COVID. Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. They started working on it. They got some funding for this and, iterated. And one day they kind of picked their heads up and they go like, wait a second, hold on. Shouldn't we try to see if we can sell this, try to do some pre-sales?
Yeah.
Because like, maybe like, what's the point of this? And so they go to their advisor and their advisor's like, what? Are you stupid? Like, go prove that you can even do this. Go build the thing. It's COVID. Of course we need COVID tests.
Yeah.
Like the market is so obviously in need of what you're doing. Like, stop second thinking this. Go prove you can test COVID. And they're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Okay. So they walked back in the lab and continued to execute. A few weeks later, boom, they had a COVID test. And so there are some cases where you don't need to follow that logic, where just build the thing, prove that it can be done. Yeah. But usually, generally, in the hardware space, like you kind of want to prove that people will use or need or want to buy the thing before you spend thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, and inevitably millions, in order to get a product to market.
That makes sense. Yeah, it does seem to be this thing where like, if you can make someone live twice as long, of course everybody's going to buy that. But like in software, it seems like software lends itself to this problem where you build something no one wants a lot more, and deep tech has less of those challenges, but it's something you should probably still at least think through. Take 10 minutes and call somebody and see if they buy it. Worth doing.
Yeah. No, that's very insightful. I'll add to that by saying that deep tech does generally have the benefit of products being more market, let's say, needed or driven, but not by an absolute measure. So it's not like 100% of deep tech companies or products, right? Like I've done 2 of them where it was like, oh, does the market really need cheaper solar panels? It turns out that if you look at the economics of solar, what we could use is actually more efficient solar panels. So higher price, but higher performance. And we're going for the inverse, lowest possible cost, willing to sacrifice on performance to get ultra low cost. So it turns out we were optimizing in the complete inverse direction as was needed by the market. The other thing that I'll say that having worked in software a little bit, I'll say is frustrating is you can absolutely spend thousands of hours crafting and honing and tuning your landing page and your website and this button where it leads.
Yeah.
How a person uses your app. Is it satisfying? Is it not? All these different factors. And then when you put it in front of someone, they could just shrug and be like,
I don't need it.
like, yeah, because at the end of the day, you're competing against people's desire to use Facebook or
Yeah.
Instagram or Twitter or YouTube or what have you. And just the same way, Netflix competes with sleep, you're competing with a bunch of other people's priorities. So, especially in the space of software, get in front of people as quickly as you possibly can. And all of that building and iterating you're doing in private is actually often a waste. Again, there's exceptions to every rule.
Right.
Just
No,
my 2 cents.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, this is kind of a left-hand turn, but I'm quite
Sure.
curious about it. The
Yeah.
macro environment seems to really lend itself to deep tech problems at the moment. Like capital is very cheap. Is that really the case? Is it easier than it has been in the past to get these things started?
So it's tricky because great businesses will always be in demand regardless of what the economy looks like.
Gotcha.
If we're in a session, if we're in a recession, I should say, an economic boom, it doesn't matter. Great companies are always going to get funded regardless. So if you're showing that you're growing, 500% year after year, no one cares. They're just going to give you money.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Right.
It doesn't matter.
That's just how it is.
Yeah.
That's just how it is. On the other hand, there is something to be said about how cheaper cost of capital, because of the macro forces in more people wanting to get into venture capital, has
Yeah.
made it easier for companies that need to raise many millions of dollars to do it at a rate that is acceptable to their dilution.
Right.
So a different way to think about this is basically, how much of my company do I have to give away to hit the next big milestone?
Got it.
And based on what the funding environment looks like, that amount of capital that you'll get for giving away a set, say 10% or 20% of your company, looks different based on the macro environments. So as an example, if it takes you $10 million to build your first prototype, well, you could kind of reasonably show how, if you had a bulletproof team, really good prototype designs, or sorry, even blueprint designs, and
Yeah.
then some MATLAB simulation that shows how you would make this thing, if it's a fusion reactor, let's say,
Yeah.
then you could reasonably see how you could raise, in this macro environment, you could give away 20% of your company for that 10 mil. That seems within the realm of possibility. Whereas a decade ago, that wasn't the case.
Gotcha.
I think Stripe raised, they gave away some absurd, I'm definitely going to get this wrong. So someone please, fact check me here, but it was like 10, actually looking at the Y Combinator deal might be a better factor there. YC used to give out like 20K for their 7%.
Oh my.
And so it's ballooned 5X, right?
Wow.
They still take the same equity. And so even that,
wow.
for the same percentage of your company that you're selling, you get way more capital. So what that allows you to do basically is say, okay, if we assemble the top tier talent, if we have a great attack vector, as you were saying earlier, then because of the market dynamics, we can afford to tackle bigger problems at an earlier and earlier stage. Now, two interesting market dynamics with that. I think the first is the government is usually the one that tries to bridge the gap between something being venture fundable and just completely in laboratory research.
Like
the
Manhattan.
grants like the
that kind of thing. Like, it's like, we're going to do this 4 years. It's going to be super expensive. Like, no one else can fund this. We're going to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was the same thing with the Apollo program, but now private companies are going to space.
Yeah.
Why? Because it's a reasonable, you can accumulate a reasonable amount of capital in this macro environment to spend on de-risking the parts of getting to space. So that's one factor. So it's SBIR grants, it's government grants, NSF, so on and so forth. Then the other factor is because more and more investors are trying to capture this pie of venture returns, they're going earlier and earlier and earlier into the stack. So normally you would see this, you can raise a $10 million round. That would typically be a Series A.
Yeah.
And now some companies are raising that in their seed round. I've got another friend who raised an $8 million seed. Wow. And that's, absolutely unheard of. Good Lord. Absolutely ridiculous. And it's just enabling more companies than ever before. So I think we're at a great place to do these really hard, really economically inefficient and deeply resource intensive projects nowadays because of the venture model, but also because software is starting to show that it is easily or it can't easily be defended. So Notion is actually being competed against by Microsoft, who just launched a Notion clone this month.
Oh, really?
So yeah, right. Whereas it's very tough for someone to try and copy what SpaceX is doing. You can't just like grab their rocket out and say like, oh, how is this thing constructed? Let me just copy that.
Right.
But you can just play around with a software piece continually and get that clone. So the differentiation, it becomes really difficult. It's the same thing I think with Microsoft Teams, where I think there's now more Microsoft Teams users than there are Slack users because of the distribution through Microsoft. So Slack was kind of pressured to work with and be acquired by Salesforce in order to keep themselves relevant in this sphere, in this ecosystem. So yeah, it's a multitude of factors that are coming together to enable now more than ever some of these big projects. And like the last thing I'll say is it's never been a better time to be a founder. It's never been easier to raise capital. There've never been more people who are excited to build and work on startups. And I don't know how long this environment will last. I don't think that it'll be this way, indefinitely. Like everything, there's a boom bust cycle. Right. So we don't know where the economy might decide to tank in 2 or 3 years, and so therefore the ease of raising will. And remember, as long as you're the next Airbnb or Facebook or Tesla, you'll be able to raise no matter what. But if you're a first-time founder, you're just trying it out and whatnot, it might be a little harder. But right now is a brilliant time. So Will, if you have any ideas that you've been thinking about starting, get in there, get in the ringer, my man.
It's time.
What are you doing?
Yeah, exactly. No, that's super interesting. I'm curious if you think. I definitely agree that recessions come. Things they return, but it almost seems like this is a trend that will continue as everyone searches for yield. Like you're looking for yield. Like you have to push farther down the risk continuum to get more reward now. Because like negative interest rates and things like that.
Sure.
Do you think this will be like
stimulus?
Somewhat, this elevated place we're at will continue longer than people realize, perhaps? I don't know. That's a weird pet theory I have.
Well, that depends. So why don't you put a boundary on what people think, right? Well, why don't you be the average person, and then I'll try to contrast and respond to that. What do you think the average person anticipates?
Gotcha. I don't know. I see, Joe Lonesdale, is that his name? On Twitter talking to Delian. Is that his name? I can't pronounce that.
I only read it. The two shit posters.
Exactly. Exactly. And Joe's like, be careful with Varda because, you won't be able to raise this way forever. Recession's coming very, very soon. And how soon's very soon? I don't know. The next 3 years, let's say. Time boxes like that. But I do wonder if this is like things may revert a little bit, but we are at a more heightened stage as more and more fun, more and more eyes are on venture. Venture used to be weird, it used to be this weird thing, and now it seems like a lot more people are in it.
Absolutely. I think the question in there was, do we think that in 3 years, if there is a theoretical recession, that it will like shatter the ability
blow
for
it up
people
forever.
to
Exactly.
I don't think so, because so history isn't a good predictor of the future. We know that history generally rhymes, but if you looked at what happened in the .com bubble, which I wasn't an investor back then, I was a kid, a toddler. Nice. But nevertheless, you saw a lot of internet companies get hyped completely to the moon,
right? And
then the stock market basically collapsed for those internet companies. And if you maintained your holdings, then you would have maintained holdings in Apple and in, I want to say, Amazon. And so it turns out that those two were incredible companies to have bought and hold, like both at the upset, as it was ramping up at the peak and then at the bottom, at the crash of that period. So it's definitely not going to go back down to zero, because our need for, as a society, the necessity is the mother of innovation and invention. And we need more solutions to problems today than we have ever have before. We have more complicated, nuanced issues than ever. So even if you just tackle one simple thing like climate change, anytime anyone has a new idea for what they can do to work against climate change, whether it's a new way of generating energy or a new way of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere or a new way of growing trees or food or what have you,
Yeah.
the most efficient path to getting that project into the commercial space, generating revenue and actually achieving its mission
Right.
is through the juice, the acceleration, the boost of capital. It takes money to make money. That's a pretty common phrase in business. So there will always be people that are risk tolerant, that understand that 80% of the things that they will invest in will go to zero, but believe that they'll find the 20% of things that will be the next Google, the next Tesla, so on and so forth. So it'll never go away because our need to solve problems will never go away. But the ability to which folks who are not Elon Musk level can raise capital, their ability to exist and not exist is transient with the state of the economy. Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. I really like that. I think that's a great way to put it. James, where do you come down on the tech stagnation thesis? And I'm really curious on your opinion because you're right on top of these things. Do you feel that innovation is in the real world is continuing? It's going pretty well at this point, or is it going like okay? And I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So I we've had so much success up until this point that I feel like a lot of people are taking it for granted. Software has been the biggest accelerating force we've experienced in the past 2 decades. So the incredible utility that's been brought to us by Amazon, Facebook, Meta / Google, and so on and so forth has been staggering. And I use their products multiple times a day. Whereas if you compare that to the obvious stresses of things like a crumbling infrastructure,
yeah,
it's easy to say like, hey, every year we get a new and better iPhone. How come we're not getting better railroads and power lines and cargo freight ships every year? And the reality of it is the two of those have a different competing interest in terms of like public allocation, in terms of public facing brands. And generally, I like what's his name? Tim Urban has a blog called Wait But Why.
Yeah, it's great.
He has a brilliant
really
blog. If you guys, phenomenal. He's a brilliant essayist who has this concept of the human megalith, of the human monolith, where basically he posits or he positions that because society has so much capacity, we have so much ability, whatever we organize to tackle, we generally overcome. And that's true. I think that allocation of problems that we address is often reflected by where the mimetic interest is in society. And I think reasonably, it follows in a place where you get rewards reasonably easily in proportion to the energy that you put in. And that makes sense, right? As human beings, we're naturally driven to seek out reward. We have a very robust dopaminergic cycle that's evolved over hundreds of millions of years to give us this ability to seek, experiment, and then be rewarded from said experiments. And as we now see with social media, that can be engineered in a way to make things extraordinarily engaging and in some cases addicting. And in places like software, the ability to get feedback, and you're seeing that especially in crypto, for an idea that's been put out there, it comes on the order of seconds. Whereas building a new port, let's say, or new power lines takes, unfortunately, years, if not decades. So the speed of the rewards center of the brain is far more stimulated by these fast turnaround areas.
Right.
And so I think that's where we see a lot more activity easily. Now, there's this counterbalance of saying, well, at a certain point, if we can't build new roads and we can't get new power lines that are sent, what are we going to do as a country?
Right.
Right. Like my take on that is, it is. So the way you kind of balance that out is typically, if it's done, I don't want to say correctly, but through the capital mechanisms that we have here in the US, the market will figure out what the right rate for that is. So it'll be that you get compensated instead of like by, your dopamine being triggered from, ooh, like people like this post. So
Right.
I got like 1,000 likes. This is exciting. Instead, it'll be like, wow, there's a bounty for a multi-billion-dollar project for me to like go build this thing.
Yeah.
Like, okay, yeah, I kind of want that multi-billion-dollar reward. And so I think the incentives naturally tease their way out economically.
That makes sense.
Now, the thing that I'll say that I do agree with, there's a lot of people that comment on stagnation. I think in the realm of physics, we've seen a lot of physics be stagnant in the fact that like the last useful piece of physics that we saw commercialized was like nuclear and semiconductors.
Yeah.
And like we haven't really been able to do a lot of useful commercial level physics with what's being done at the cutting edge these days. Like, we understand the Higgs boson exists now. We understand about gravitational waves, but we can't really do much with there's no real use or utility to those technologies. So I will admit that there are some places where it feels like potentially we may have mined through the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
But we're seeing that software is able to restructure a lot of information that we maybe took for granted or we didn't realize was useful. So one thing that I really like that I'm seeing is companies that are building new fusion reactors modeled entirely from really great physics simulation through software to say, actually, there's new ways we can try to make fusion work, right? Getting a helping hand from algorithms. And so I imagine that when we have like truly hardcore, like GDP 6, right? But like for academia, for chemistry, for physics, you see this already in biology. Like GDP 3, it turns out for bio is already good enough, but we'll need a GDP 5 for chemistry and probably GDP 6 or 8 for physics. But I anticipate that we'll start to see a bit of a renaissance just by kind of mining some of this old data that hasn't necessarily been leveraged yet. However, I think that there is a certain level of utility that comes in working from different levels of abstraction away from, let's say, the atomic scale. So like, why is biology, as an example, such a booming field?
Yeah.
Well, it turns out that biology is just such a relevant part of our lives. And biology is built up of chemistry, which is built up of physics. So it's two levels abstracted away from like what we would consider the fundamentals.
Yeah.
And so it's very close to the ability to be actuated. And so there's so much in biology that is leverageable, that is manipulable, that we have the ability to leverage and utilize. But if you, as a person, were sick and I was like, oh, hey, I've got this really great way to detect black holes in a distant, galaxy. You're just like, I don't
really care.
Like why, why is this useful? I guess I'm kind of inspired. Not now.
Later, James.
Exactly. Yeah. Sorry. Exactly. So I think that there's going to be more innovation. I think just like anything else, just like a human attention, we're seeing flow in different directions.
Yeah.
And I think once again, going back to Elon, he did a great job proving that really hard technical things can be done
still possible
by a coordinated, motivated group of people. And that gave me the faith to start my companies. And it's shown that we aren't done innovating in the world of atoms.
That's really good. And I love that point, knowing that having some kind of model and seeing that it's possible, it seems really important. And this segues into the kind of my last big question here as we run up on our time here. The fellowship, how has it been?
Yeah.
And could you pitch it to us, and where can people find it?
Sure. So we're talking about the On Deck Deep Tech Fellowship, which I'm one of the co-founders and the program partner there. Abhijit is the program director. And we are creating a playground for people who are deeply technical and who are interested in building, joining, and accelerating the careers in the deep tech space. So this is for founders who want access to potential hires. So we have a person that actually managed to hire, I want to say 3 people from the Deep Tech Fellowship already.
Nice.
We've gotten people jobs at companies they would have never had access to. Founders have been fundraising. We've been able to make customer intros. We're having, sessions about how to apply for government grants, how to think about intellectual property. We have mastermind groups where you get to nerd out with other people in your same space, right? So if you're a biotech founder thinking about how to use AI to understand potential biologics for disease, we can introduce you to other people who are also doing the same thing, but thinking about it from an entrepreneurial perspective, as opposed to an academic, how do I get papers out of the door perspective. It's just a brilliant melting pot of people who all have the same desire to make a massive impact in the deep tech space. And I'm just so grateful to be a part of building this community. So you can find it on beondeck.com/deep tech. We also have Twitter. So we have Be On Deck is the Twitter handle. I'm at James Sinka, 2 S's, JamesSinka. And yeah, if you're trying to innovate in the world of atoms and you want to surround yourself with other people who are curious, who are passionate, who are like-minded, and have a startup edge, you don't necessarily have to want to start a company. You can want to be an early joiner or an explorer, or help, even if you're someone that's seasoned, that's built companies in different ecosystems, but you want to help other folks navigate their way. Maybe you're someone that's worked at a big software company that wants to help someone who's working in biotech figure out how they can leverage modern software, off-the-shelf tools, or even AI like GTP3 for some of these biological computations. We'd love to have you. So the fellowship has been great. I love it.
It's really cool. It's really cool. I highly recommend everyone apply. Do you know when the next cycle is by any chance for folks?
Yes. So
listening?
Yep. We're going to open up the next set of cycles in Q1 of next year. We're working out on when the right time is to bring everyone into a position where we're ready to handle all of the inbound. We have people actually right now, if you want to apply, we have a wait list, and we get applications on our wait list already. So you don't have to necessarily wait, but the next cohort will start, we're thinking February, March time.
Nice.
Yeah.
Super cool. Well, James, thank you so much for coming on. I learned a ton from you today. So where can people find you? I think you mentioned your Twitter handle. Is that a good place to find you personally?
Yes. So I'm at James Sinka on Twitter, and I've also got a website. It's JamesSinka.com. It'll just be the same thing for all of my socials, right? But yeah, thank you so much for having me on, Will. This was entertaining.
Thanks, James.